They laughed when he stepped onto the stage. One boy, no coach, wearing a suit to sizes too big. He didn't belong, they thought. But when he opened his mouth, the whole room went silent. What happened next would shatter the most prestigious debate tournament in the country and change how the world sees genius forever. The murmurs started the moment he stepped onto the polished stage. A lean black teenager in worn-out sneakers, a secondhand suit to sizes too big, and no team banner. Behind him, no school insignia, no recognizable coach by his side. The Yale Invitational Debate Tournament was not a place for underdogs. It was the Ivy League's intellectual coliseum where silver spoon prodigies from prep academies competed in verbal swordplay for prestige, scholarships, and polished trophies. So when Elijah Freeman, a 17-year-old from Southside Chicago, appeared alone and ranked, unaccompanied, and unnoticed until that moment, laughter followed. Some students snickered behind monogrammed folders. Others whispered, "What school is he even from?" One elite competitor from Exeter leaned over to her teammate and said, "He probably thinks this is an open mic." But Elijah didn't flinch. He took a deep breath and adjusted his cracked glasses. His debate number, handwritten on a piece of paper and pinned to his lapel, was all the official documentation he had. He didn't come for attention. He came for the mic. The first round began. His opponent, Yale's own top-seeded champion, Gregory Langford III, a legacy student with 5 national titles under his belt, and a father on the university's board. The room filled with observers, eager to watch the public dismantling of the outsider. The moderator announced the topic: should developing nations prioritize economic growth over environmental sustainability? Gregory went first. His argument was smooth, meticulous, rehearsed. He wielded economic statistics and quoted foreign policy authors with polished diction. Applause followed his final point. Then Elijah stood. His voice didn't thunder. It resonated with pain, clarity, and conviction. "I don't have a fancy name," he began, "but I have lived in a home that flooded every summer because our city's storm drains weren't meant for people who looked like me. I've seen smog settle into the playgrounds of my neighborhood, while economic growth meant tearing down affordable housing to build shopping centers." He didn't just debate the resolution. He embodied it. He flipped the argument inside out, using lived experience, peer-reviewed studies, and raw logic that left the judges stunned. He turned a policy question into a matter of humanity and exposed the blindness of privilege. Silence. Then thunderous applause. Round after round, Elijah tore through competitors like wildfire through dry grass. His opponents underestimated him until they heard him speak. He dismantled arguments with surgical precision. He cited philosophers and economists with ease, often pulling references from a battered notebook he'd carried since 9th grade, filled with handwritten excerpts from late-night library sessions. Every victory silenced more doubters. By the quarterfinals, rooms were packed just to hear him speak. By the semifinals, news of the boy from nowhere spread like gospel. By the finals, even Gregory Langford III sat in the audience not as a finalist, but as a witness. The final round topic: resolved in times of crisis. National security should override individual privacy. Elijah stood across from a well-funded, top-tier private academy team. He listened, then rose slowly. "I come from a community where we're stopped, frisked, and watched every day," he said. "They say it's for safety, but they never ask, who gets to define the word secure?" He exposed the hypocrisy in surveillance tactics. He spoke of dignity, of history, of how freedom isn't a reward, it's a birthright. His arguments weren't just logical, they were undeniable. When the final scores were announced, there was no suspense. Elijah Freeman, champion of the Yale Invitational. The room exploded, but he didn't raise his arms. He didn't cheer. He just bowed his head, smiled softly, and looked out at the crowd, not with arrogance, but purpose. One judge, a retired Supreme Court litigator, approached him after. "Where did you train?" Elijah replied, "In the kitchen. While my mom worked double shifts, I'd watch debate, videos on a cracked phone, and practice arguments in the mirror. I've never had a coach, just something to say." A week later, video clips of Elijah's performances went viral. Universities reached out. Scholarships followed. TEDx sent an invite. He was featured on 60 Minutes, but he never forgot. He returned to Southside Chicago and started a debate league at his former school. He taught kids that their voices were weapons, not burdens, that brilliance didn't wear a uniform, that sometimes the world laughs right before it listens. And for every student who ever felt invisible, his story echoed like a war drum. They laughed when he walked on stage. They never laughed again. The day after the tournament, Elijah sat alone on the steps of the debate hall. The trophy taller than the duffel bag he came with rested beside him. A professor from Princeton had tried to take him to dinner, but he declined. A camera crew from CNN waited by the street. He hadn't said yes to them either. What the cameras couldn't capture was the silence in his chest, the kind of silence that comes when your entire world changes in a single weekend. He stared at the sky, blinking hard, as if the stars themselves might make sense of what just happened. He reached for his phone, the same cracked screen he used to research his speeches. Under flickering streetlights, he opened a message from his mom. "I watched you on YouTube. Baby, they clap for you like you were born to do this. I knew it all along. Your dad would be proud." His throat tightened. He texted back, "Coming home. Let's talk scholarships tonight." By Monday, Yale's debate board had rewritten their history. For the first time in the tournament's existence, an unaffiliated student, no coach, no sponsor, no institutional support, had won the grand championship. The post-tournament forums buzzed with questions. Who is Elijah Freeman? Why didn't anyone recruit him before? Is it even possible to speak like that without formal training? They didn't understand. Elijah hadn't trained the traditional way. He had sharpened his skills debating his uncle about Black history, over broken pancakes, arguing his way out of police stops with calm precision, defending his dreams in front of school administrators who tried to track him into vocational programs. He learned that words could save lives or destroy them. The offers came in waves. Harvard offered a full ride. So did Stanford. One dean called him a national treasure. He even got a personal letter from President Bartlett of the American Debate Union, inviting him to speak at their next conference. But Elijah hesitated, because something in him knew that trophies alone weren't enough. He thought of Marcus, the boy from his block who had the same mind, maybe even sharper, but who dropped out last year after losing his brother to gang violence. He thought of Simone, who used to write poetry but stopped when their school's arts funding got cut. He couldn't let Yale be the peak of his journey. It had to be the start. 3 months later, Elijah launched Project Mic Drop, a nonprofit designed to bring debate training, public speaking, and policy education to underfunded schools and community centers across the U.S. His first workshop took place in a church basement on the South Side. 15 kids showed up, then 30, then hundreds. He partnered with local colleges, lawyers, and journalists. He taught kids how to argue, how to listen, how to matter, not just in competitions but in courtrooms, classrooms, and living rooms. At a regional youth debate event he organized, a 6th grader named Zaire stood up and delivered a closing argument so powerful it made the judges cry. When asked where he learned to speak like that, Zaire simply said, "From the guy who wore the broken glasses." Years later, Elijah stood on a different stage, this one inside the U.S. Capitol. He had just been confirmed as the youngest director of national civic engagement in American history. Reporters packed the room. Lawmakers leaned forward, and as he adjusted his tie still a little awkwardly, like he always had, he took a deep breath and began. But before his first words, he scanned the crowd. He saw his mother, seated in the front row, smiling through tears. He saw Simone, now a spoken word teacher, mouthing, "Go get him." And he saw a boy in the back, hoodie, wide eyes, notebook in hand, watching him like the world had cracked open. Elijah smiled. He began with the same words he had once used in that tiny Yale classroom. When the world first started listening, "I don't have a fancy name, but I have something to say." Because sometimes history isn't made by the loudest voice in the room. It's made by the one no one expects, the one they laughed at until he opened his mouth and changed everything. The boy they underestimated became the man who redefined the power of a voice. They laughed when he walked on stage. But the world rose when he left it. Elijah's rise became more than a personal victory, it became a movement. Everywhere he went, he carried a quiet kind of fire, not loud, not boastful, but undeniable. He began appearing on panels beside heads of state and Supreme Court justices, offering clear, piercing insight into the real-world consequences of policies debated by people who had never set foot in communities like his. They expected him to be emotional, passionate, maybe even radical, but Elijah was strategic. He didn't shout to be heard. He made silence his weapon. When others filibustered, he paused, made them lean in. When they attacked, he asked questions that made them rethink their own beliefs. He had learned that changing the world didn't always start with power. Sometimes it started with presence. One afternoon, a high school principal from Mississippi called. Her students had watched Elijah's Yale debate on YouTube and wanted to start their own team. But they had no funding, no materials, and no one to coach. Elijah didn't send a donation. He got on a plane. He stood in their cafeteria the following Friday, in front of 50 wide-eyed teenagers. Some had never been out of state. A few had never spoken in front of a group. Elijah didn't care. He looked them in the eye and said, "If you can tell your story, no one can take your future." That night, those students debated topics ranging from climate justice to healthcare equity. It wasn't polished, but it was raw and honest and real. 2 years later, that Mississippi school won its state championship. Every door that opened for Elijah, he propped wide for others. He didn't just build programs. He built pathways. He worked with incarcerated youth, teaching them how to craft persuasive narratives that helped them argue for reduced sentences, educational access, and dignity behind bars. He worked with refugee students, giving them tools to challenge anti-immigrant rhetoric with facts, history, and heart. He even returned to Yale, this time not as a competitor, but as a keynote speaker. In the same debate hall where they once laughed at him, he stood before a sea of fresh debaters and said, "The mic doesn't belong to the elite. It belongs to whoever dares to speak truth in a room that expects silence." They gave him a standing ovation before he even finished. But it wasn't all triumph. There were critics, powerful ones. Some claimed he was too political, too blunt, too dangerous for the comfort of tradition. An op-ed once called him a polished radical in a suit and said his programs were training future disruptors, not leaders. Elijah framed that article and hung it in his office because he believed leadership should disrupt what needed changing. He wasn't interested in making students blend in. He was interested in helping them stand out. Years later, a film crew followed Elijah for a documentary. At one point, the director asked, "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you never walked into that Yale tournament?" Elijah smiled, looking out at a classroom of teenagers practicing rebuttals. "Every day, that laugh they gave me on stage, it lit a fuse I didn't know I had." He paused. "But I think about something else more. I think about all the voices who never got the mic. My job now is making sure they do." At age 35, Elijah Freeman was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom, not just for his work in education, but for redefining what it means to speak for the people. The president, a former lawyer herself, called him a national compass pointing the country toward conscience, not convenience. That night, during his acceptance speech, Elijah didn't talk about awards or titles. He talked about a cracked pair of glasses, a torn debate jacket, a room that laughed when they saw him and applauded when he left. He looked straight into the camera and said, "To every kid watching this who feels invisible, unheard, or out of place, remember, your voice can turn a room. Don't wait for permission. Walk up to the mic, and somewhere, in a school gym, or a shelter, or a quiet bedroom where a kid with a notebook dreams big dreams, someone heard him." They clicked play on that old YouTube video. They saw Elijah walk on stage. They saw the laughter, and they saw the silence that followed as he shattered the room with truth. And they realized that mic could be theirs, that voice could be heard, that moment could be next. Because once upon a time, they laughed at him, and he turned that laughter into history. Years passed, but the legend only grew, not because Elijah chased fame, but because he kept planting seeds in the dark, seeds that bloomed long after he left the room. He'd once walked into Yale alone, carrying nothing but a notebook and a storm inside him. Now, that storm had watered a forest of young minds who knew how to think, how to speak, and how to stand. One of those minds belonged to a girl named Amara Holt. She was 13 when she first met Elijah. She had a stutter, barely looked people in the eye, and had been suspended twice for talking back. But Elijah saw what others didn't. You don't talk back, he told her. You talk brave. Let's sharpen that. Under his guidance, Amara started writing her own speeches. She learned how to hold a room not with volume, but with vision. By 16, she was testifying before her state legislature to demand changes in juvenile justice laws. By 18, she was leading her own debate mentorship chapter in Detroit. One day, after giving a speech at a national summit, Amara texted Elijah a single sentence, "You gave me the mic, now I'm passing it." This was Elijah's real legacy, a chain of voices linked not by privilege but by purpose. He never taught kids to win arguments. He taught them to ask better questions, to dismantle lazy logic, to challenge false authority, to defend the voiceless, to tell the truth even when it shakes the room. He gave them tools not to survive the system, but to reshape it. One evening, Elijah walked into a bookstore in Harlem. The lights were low, the chairs filled with young students and tired parents. At the front, a chalkboard read, "Speak loud," a community open mic. He hadn't been invited. He didn't need to be. He sat quietly in the back, hat low, listening. A boy stepped up to the microphone, nervous, shaky, maybe 11 years old. He opened his notebook and began. "They said I talked too much in class, so I wrote it all down instead. My notebook became my classroom, my silence became my stage, and now, I'm gonna make 'em listen." The boy didn't know Elijah was there, but Elijah smiled anyway, because this was everything. Later that night, as Elijah walked home through the city streets, a thought struck him. He remembered how it all started, not with victory, but with doubt, not with applause, but with laughter, and how beautiful it was that what had once tried to break him had built a bridge for thousands. He pulled out his phone and wrote a message he'd been thinking about for years. It was to Gregory Langford III, the Ivy League star he'd defeated in that very first round, now a lawyer for a lobbying firm in D.C. "Still remember that day," Elijah wrote. Gregory replied almost instantly, "How could I forget? You rewrote the rules. Congrats on everything, man. For what it's worth, I learned more from losing to you than winning any tournament." Elijah smiled and texted back, "Good, that's the real victory, today." There's a mural on the wall of Elijah's old high school. It doesn't show him holding a trophy. It shows a boy in broken glasses, standing behind a podium, a microphone in front of him, a crowd in shadow. Above it, in bold letters, is the quote that has traveled farther than any medal he ever won. "They laughed when I walked on stage, but they never laughed again." And below it, "Your voice is your power. Use it, because the greatest stories aren't about the loudest applause. They're about what echoes long after the room goes quiet." And Elijah Freeman, he didn't just shatter a tournament. He shattered every ceiling that tried to hold people like him back, and gave the mic to a generation that refuses to be silent. This isn't just a story. It's a blueprint, and it's only the beginning. Elijah Freeman's story kept unfolding quietly, powerfully, and with relentless purpose. He didn't write a memoir. He refused to. When publishers offered millions for the rights to his life story, he turned them down and redirected the offers to fund the building of the Freeman Institute for Civic Expression, a sprawling campus in Atlanta, designed to train youth from underserved communities in public speaking, law, journalism, and policy making. He said once in a speech, "I don't want my life to be a best-selling book. I want it to be a blueprint that thousands can live by." At the Institute's grand opening, thousands gathered. There were no red carpets, no VIP sections, just rows of students, mentors, and community leaders, all dressed in different colors, from different cities, speaking different dialects, but united by one thing: voice. During the opening ceremony, a woman in her 70s walked up to Elijah with tears in her eyes. "Do you remember me?" she asked. He didn't. "I was one of the judges at Yale, the first round." I laughed when you walked in." She paused, trembling. "I've never forgotten what I saw that day. You taught me something I should have known years ago." Elijah looked at her, soft eyes behind his glasses. "I forgive you," he said, "but only if you help us build this next generation. We need you." She signed up as a volunteer writing coach that day. The Freeman Institute became a sanctuary, not just for students who wanted to debate, but for the voiceless, the forgotten, the misjudged. Young immigrants rehearsed Supreme Court cases and mock policy summits. Foster youth who'd been written off learned how to write compelling op-eds that landed in national newspapers. Formerly incarcerated teens ran town hall forums and moderated community conversations. Between police and neighborhoods, Elijah's team didn't just teach argument, they taught articulation, empathy, courage. It was common to hear a 15-year-old quoting James Baldwin one moment and grilling a city council member the next. One girl, Sasha from the Bronx, delivered a closing statement in a citywide competition so powerful, the mayor in attendance offered her a spot as a junior advisor on the city's youth council. She turned it down. "I want to finish the work here first," she said. Elijah taught me that influence without foundation crumbles. In the background of all this, Elijah remained humble. No limelight, no personal brand, no private jet speaking tours. Just one suitcase worth of worn suits and notebooks, and a mission that burned inside him like it had that very first day at Yale. At one quiet point, a journalist caught up with him on a train from D.C. to Baltimore and asked him, "Do you ever think about the moment it all changed?" Elijah nodded. Not the stage, not the applause. It was the laugh, that sound in the room, that was the moment, not because it hurt, but because it proved how small their imagination was and how big ours had to be. In his 40s, Elijah was invited to deliver the keynote at the United Nations Global Youth Assembly. He stood in front of 193 country flags and thousands of delegates from across the globe. But he didn't open with statistics or policy language. He opened with a story of a boy with secondhand shoes and broken glasses, walking into a room he wasn't supposed to belong in, and choosing to speak anyway. And then, with every nation watching, he paused and said, "The world doesn't change when powerful people speak. It changes when powerless people stop waiting for permission." Before he left the stage, a standing ovation erupted, longer than any that day. But as always, Elijah only smiled, nodded, and walked off quietly, leaving behind an echo stronger than applause. Years from now, students will study Elijah Freeman not because he won a tournament, but because he taught the world to listen, not just with ears, with intention. With courage, with humility, and somewhere in a public school or a shelter or a library, a child will ask, "Who was Elijah Freeman?" And the teacher won't say, "He was a champion." They'll say, "He was the reason we believed we could speak," because they laughed when he walked on stage, but the world stood up when he left it. And in that silence between laughter and legacy, he changed everything.